The February wind screamed across the Dakota Territory flats like a wounded beast driving snow so thick it turned the world into a howling white void where death stalked silent and unseen. Takala pressed his spine against the ice-crusted cottonwood Winchester steady, despite the agony shooting through his wounded hip with each heartbeat. The old cavalry bullet from Washita had never healed properly, serving as a constant reminder that survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead of enemies who killed without conscience. Behind him, through the blizzard's fury, the Morrison cabin hunched like a dying animal seeking shelter. Grace Morrison's voice carried through the thin walls, calm, soothing, spinning beautiful lies to terrify her sons about how everything would be fine, while their world crumbled around them. She was Martin Morrison's widow, and the company bookkeeper who'd sought Takala out 3 months ago with trembling hands and the hollow eyes of a man who already knew he was marked for death. "You're the only one Conrad Dietrich can't purchase or break," Martin had whispered behind Kellerman's store, glancing over his shoulder with the paranoia of hunted prey. "My boys need protection when I'm gone. Someone to witness their inheritance, someone who understands what Conrad truly is beneath his civilized facade." Takala had signed those water rights papers because Conrad's stamp mill was poisoning Willow Creek, destroying the grass his band's ponies needed to survive the brutal winters. Because last year, Conrad's hired killers had burned their winter food stores while claiming the Lakota were raiding supply lines they'd never touched. Because his sister, Winona's infant daughter, had starved during the cruel months that followed her tiny body growing cold in his arms, while he swore oaths of vengeance that still burned like acid in his throat. Now Martin lay crushed beneath an ore cart accident they claimed, and his widow was learning the true cost of that signature. Orange muzzle flash bloomed through the storm like a deadly flower. Takala's Winchester spoke first, the 44-40 slug, taking the lead enforcer's center mass and spinning him backward into snow that immediately began drinking his blood. 2 others scattered like startled wolves, but not before Takala glimpsed wool coats and tin badges identifying them as Conrad's private army rather than regular cavalry. They wanted Grace and the boys alive for now. "Takala," Wikasa's voice cut through the wind from the cabin doorway, where his blood brother stood silhouetted against firelight, 2 small forms pressed against his legs. "The woman calls for you." Inside the cabin, Grace Morrison knelt beside a fire, dying for lack of fuel. Her dark hair escaping careful pins to frame a face that showed every one of her 25 years and the weight of 3 months spent looking over her shoulder. Martin's oversized coat hung loose on her slender frame, pitifully inadequate against weather that could kill in minutes. Her sons Hugh, 7 years old with his father's serious eyes, and Archie, barely 5, and fighting a persistent cough, huddled close enough to share her warmth, while watching the door with the hypervigilant awareness of children who'd learned that safety was a luxury they couldn't afford. She looked up as Takala entered, and her eyes held unexpected depths, not the washed-out blue common to most whites, but darker like creek water running deep over smooth stones. Eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow for someone so young, but still burned with fierce protectiveness that had driven her into a killing blizzard rather than surrender her children to Conrad's false mercy. "I heard shooting," she said quietly, her voice steady despite hands that trembled as she pulled Archie closer. "How many?" "3. 1 down, 2 running back for reinforcements." Takala set his rifle aside and crouched by the failing fire, adding their last precious kindling, while his mind calculated time distance and the capabilities of men who murdered for wages. "They'll return within the hour with enough guns to finish this properly." Grace's breath caught, not with fear, he realized, but with grim acceptance of someone who'd been expecting this moment since her husband's convenient death. "Martin told me before the accident that if anything happened, I should find you. He said you'd witness the boy's inheritance, that you'd understand why Conrad wants us gone." "What water rights to Willow Springs?" Takala nodded toward the creek, though its cheerful babbling was muffled by wind that carried the scent of more snow, more death. Conrad needs clean water for his stamp mill. The more he controls, the more ore he can process. Your husband was clever enough to transfer ownership to the boys before Conrad could file competing claims. He's been pressuring me to sign new papers I can't read properly. Says if I don't cooperate, he'll petition the territorial court to remove the boys for their protection. Her voice dropped to prevent the children from hearing details that would terrify them. Claims a widow living alone can't provide proper supervision. Hughes stepped forward with protective instinct that 7 years of uncertainty had forced to develop too early. "Mama, who is this man?" Grace's hand settled on her son's thin shoulder. "This is Tokala Hugh. He was your father's friend, and he's going to help us through this trouble." The boy studied Tokala with the direct gaze children used when measuring adults for trustworthiness. Despite his fear, Hugh's chin remained steady. "Are you going to fight the bad men?" "I'm going to keep my promise to your father." Tokala replied, meeting the child's eyes with the same respect he'd show any adult. "He asked me to protect your family. I intend to honor that agreement." Wikasa appeared at the window like a ghost made of shadow and alertness. Riders approaching up the creek trail. 8 horses moving careful but determined. Through the cabin's thin walls, the distant sound of hoofbeats grew steadily stronger, accompanied by the metallic jingle of harness and low voices coordinating an attack that would leave no survivors. Conrad hadn't waited for intelligence reports. He'd mobilized his entire enforcement crew, bringing overwhelming force to eliminate witnesses and claim prizes that had eluded his grasp. "There's a root cellar," Grace said desperately. "Martin dug it last summer for storing vegetables. The boys could hide." "No." Tokala's voice carried the finality of someone who'd seen too many hunts end with prey, cornered in holes they thought were safe. "Conrad's men will search every hiding place, every shadow. And if we're separated when they find us..." He met her eyes directly, ensuring she understood implications that went far beyond simple kidnapping. Grace's face went pale as understanding hit like a physical blow. Conrad needed guardianship of Hugh and Archie to claim their inheritance, which meant he needed Grace either compliant or permanently silenced after she'd served his legal purposes. A rifle shot splintered the door frame, sending wood chips flying and making Archie cry out in terror. Grace instantly covered both children with her body, while Tokala and Wikasa took defensive positions, their weapons trained on tree lines, where muzzle flashes were beginning to bloom. "Morrison woman." Klaus's voice carried clearly despite the wind. Rudolf Klaus, Conrad's German foreman, who'd lost 3 fingers to industrial accidents and blamed every Indian he encountered. "Send out those boys, and we'll talk reasonable." Empty threat. Klaus needed the children alive, but Grace could hear genuine anger building in his voice. Men like Klaus enjoyed the hunt more than the capture. Grace grabbed Tokala's sleeve with fingers like ice through wool, pulling him close enough that he could see gold flecks in her dark eyes and smell faint lavender soap that somehow survived even here. "I'll belong to you forever if you'll save us," she whispered, words tumbling out in a desperate rush of honesty that cut through every social barrier between them. Not romance, Tokala understood immediately. This was survival, bargaining the only currency Grace possessed to purchase her children's lives from a man she barely knew. She was offering herself as payment, promising submission to secure protection she couldn't provide alone. Tokala looked down at her upturned face, at boys pressed against her sides, at Wikasa waiting for orders, while bullets continued their methodical destruction. Outside, Klaus's patience was eroding, and soon diplomacy would give way to direct assault. "Wikasa, take the boys to your pony," Tokala decided. "Follow the creek ice eastward toward winter camp. The storm will hide your tracks. He pressed his Colt into Grace's hands, noting how she accepted the weapon with competent familiarity. Martin taught you to shoot. Every Sunday after church, she confirmed checking the cylinder's load with practiced efficiency. We're going out through Martin's firewood gap. My horse is saddled behind that deadfall cottonwood. Tokala moved to the rear wall where the opening was just wide enough for desperate people. When I give the word run, without looking back, I'll provide covering fire and follow when I can break contact. Another volley shredded the front wall as Klaus grew tired of negotiation. Grace positioned herself at the opening with Hugh and Archie flanking her like small soldiers. Despite their terror, both boys had stopped trembling not from warmth, but from the peculiar steadiness that came to children when adults finally abandoned pretense. "Ready, master?" Tokala asked, checking his ammunition one final time. Grace met his eyes with fierce determination that had driven Martin to seek him out. In that moment, something passed between them that transcended desperate bargains, a recognition that some promises were worth keeping, regardless of personal cost. "Ready?" she breathed. "Go." The paint pony carried them across frozen Willow Creek, with hooves that found purchase through generations of winter travel, while behind them, orange flames began licking at the cabin's roof, where Klaus had finally abandoned patience for destruction. Grace pressed close against Tokala's back, feeling his solid warmth through clothes already stiffening with ice, while Hugh and Archie huddled between them like precious cargo justifying every risk. Tokala's band had wintered along this creek stretch for 3 generations, building their camp in cottonwood groves that provided windbreak protection and access to clean water, despite Conrad's upstream pollution. 7 hide teepees and 4 earth lodges clustered among bare trees like ancient fortresses designed by people who understood that cooperation meant survival when winter tested human endurance. Winona emerged from her lodge before they dismounted, weathered face creased with concern as she took in Grace's condition and the boy's obvious exhaustion. At 45, Tokala's sister had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children in a world offering no guarantees except that strong people protected weak ones or everyone died together. She spoke no English, but her hands were infinitely gentle as she guided the Morrison family toward warmth. "The little ones need hot soup and dry clothes immediately," she said in Lakota voice, carrying authority developed through decades of managing survival logistics. "The woman is stronger than she appears, but she's held herself together through willpower alone. When she finally feels safe enough to rest, she'll collapse completely." Inside the Earth Lodge, buffalo robes and steady warmth gradually restored color to faces that had gone gray with hypothermia, while Winona ladled soup from iron pots that had simmered over coals throughout the night. Both children looked better within minutes, though Archie's persistent cough worried everyone who heard its wet, rattling quality. Dr. Edwin Laurent sat cross-legged near the fire pit, medical bag open, as he examined winter herbs tribal healers had been preparing. Laurent was a thin man in his 50s, who'd earned genuine respect by treating Indian patients with the same care he provided to wealthy whites, a rarity that had made him welcome in camps where most outsiders were viewed with suspicion. "Mrs. Morrison." Laurent stood as Grace settled beside her sons. "I heard about the trouble at your cabin. Thank God you made it through safely." "You knew, Martin." Grace accepted hot tea from Winona, wrapping numb fingers around warmth while studying Laurent's face for signs of duplicity she'd learned to expect. We'd met several times recently. Martin was asking detailed questions about mining-related injuries, industrial diseases, health problems from prolonged stamp mill exposure. Laurent's expression grew thoughtful. He claimed to be updating company safety procedures, but I suspected his interest went considerably deeper. Tokala positioned himself where he could observe approaches while participating in conversation that might determine their next moves. Conrad's men came for her and the boys last night. Burned the cabin when they couldn't force surrender. Klaus won't give up easily, Laurent said grimly. The man has no conscience when Conrad's objectives are involved. What do you know about Martin's death? Grace asked directly, sensing Laurent possessed information he hadn't yet shared. Officially industrial accident. Martin was inspecting ore cart loading procedures when brake mechanisms failed. Laurent paused his medical training, making him choose words carefully. Unofficially, Martin had been questioning discrepancies in federal permit applications, environmental assessments filed late, or with incomplete data. Something cold settled in Grace's stomach. What kind of discrepancies? The kind suggesting deliberate falsification of government documents to avoid environmental restrictions and tribal consultation requirements, Conrad considered obstacles to profitable expansion. Laurent glanced around the lodge, noting how other camp members were listening carefully. Martin was building a federal case, Mrs. Morrison. The kind of investigation that could shut down Conrad's entire operation. So they killed him to prevent that investigation. I can't prove it legally, Laurent admitted. But Martin was terrified during our final conversation. He talked about making arrangements to protect his family if something happened, ensuring his evidence would reach proper authorities, even if he couldn't deliver it personally. Tokala leaned forward, firelight playing across features showing both intelligence and wariness. What kind of arrangements? Though legal partnerships witness signatures, document transfers, safeguards a careful man might establish if he suspected enemies were planning elimination before he could expose their crimes. Grace stared into flames while puzzle pieces began falling into place. Martin's increasing paranoia during final weeks, his insistence on teaching her weapons handling and basic legal procedures, mysterious trips to town. He'd never fully explained everything made sense if he'd been preparing for murder while trying to protect his family. There might be another path forward, Laurent said quietly. I'm scheduled to travel to Ash River next week, delivering medical supplies to the cavalry post. The federal marshal maintains offices there, and telegraph lines connect directly to territorial headquarters. If we had proper documentation of Conrad's illegal activities, Martin kept records. Grace said, slowly remembering her husband's meticulous habits. He had a hiding place in our cabin behind the heating stove where he stored what he called insurance papers. I never examined them because he claimed they were boring business documents. Could you retrieve them? Laurent asked. Klaus certainly has watchers posted at the cabin ruins, even if I could approach the site. Grace trailed off, recognizing the practical impossibility. The schoolhouse sits close to where your cabin stood, Tokala observed. Nora Elise has been teaching some of our children despite pressure from Conrad's supporters. She might be willing to help. Miss Elise would risk considerable danger, Laurent warned. Conrad eliminates inconvenient witnesses, regardless of their social standing. Grace looked toward the fire, where her son sat wrapped in buffalo robes, Hugh reading quietly, while Archie dozed against his brother's shoulder. Both children appeared healthier already, desperate exhaustion fading as warmth and security worked their magic. She thought about Martin's final weeks, his growing terror, and sleepless nights spent staring at shadows. About his last words concerning finding Tokala if something happened. Her husband had died trying to do right, and she would not dishonor that sacrifice by hiding while Conrad destroyed other families. How long to reach Ash River? She asked. 3 days of hard travel if weather cooperates, Laurent calculated. But the risks. I understand risks, Grace said firmly. My husband died trying to expose Conrad's crimes. I won't let that murderer profit from Martin's death." As if summoned by her words, Wicasa appeared at the lodge entrance with urgency written across features that rarely showed emotion. Riders approaching from the east, 10 men moving carefully despite storm conditions. Through howling wind, they could hear hoofbeats crunching through snow, accompanied by occasional harness jingles and low voices coordinating search patterns. Klaus had tracked them faster than expected, probably using local guides who knew winter travel techniques. "Decision time," Laurent said grimly, already reaching for coat and medical supplies. Tokala stood checking weapons while calculating escape routes. "Grace, get the boys ready for travel. We're leaving immediately before Klaus can surround the camp." "Where?" she asked. "First to recover your husband's evidence from the cabin ruins. Then to convince Nora Elise to help us reach federal authorities before Conrad can silence everyone who threatens his operations." Tokala met her eyes with steady resolve. "After that, we discover how much justice territorial government provides when protecting witnesses." As Grace hurried to prepare her sons for another desperate flight, she caught Tokala's arm with a grip that conveyed both gratitude and determination forged through shared danger. "Now, whatever happens, thank you for keeping your promise to Martin." Tokala covered her hand with his own feeling calluses from hard work and tremors from exhaustion held back through pure willpower. "Save your thanks until we're all safe and Conrad's paying for his crimes." But as Klaus's posse drew closer and time for running grew short, both understood that safety was a luxury they might not live to enjoy. And justice was something they'd have to seize personally or die trying. Dawn revealed the Morrison cabin's remains scattered across snow, like broken dreams, charred timbers, and twisted metal, creating a monument to Klaus's rage when he discovered their escape. Gray light filtered through storm clouds, illuminating destruction that spoke eloquently of violence barely held in check by operational necessity. Grace stood at destruction's edge, breath-forming crystals while she studied debris where her married life had ended in smoke and hatred. Beside her, Tokala maintained watch on surrounding forest, where movement could mean death for everyone who dared oppose Conrad's expanding empire. "The stove should be near center," Grace said quietly, pointing toward twisted iron pipes emerging from snow. Martin built the compartment into foundation stones sealed with a metal plate that resembled original construction. "Nark." "How long to excavate?" Tokala asked, eyes never leaving trees where Klaus might have positioned snipers. 10 minutes if fire didn't damage the mechanism. Grace was already moving toward Ruin's determination, overriding natural reluctance to approach places where she'd nearly died. Watch for movement. Klaus might have left someone to spring exactly this trap. Working with bare hands, despite wool mittens Winona had provided, Grace began digging through snow and ash that had frozen into chunks, requiring careful dismantling. The labor was brutal. Fingers quickly went numb, and debris was locked together by ice that had to be chipped away piece by piece, while precious minutes elapsed. But desperation provided strength that normal circumstances could never summon, and within minutes she'd located the cast iron stove, overturned, but intact, beneath covering of snow and fallen timber. Martin's hiding place remained exactly where memory placed, it protected by iron mass from fire's worst damage. The metal plate yielded with a grinding screech that made Tokala wince at its volume. But the compartment beneath stayed secure, containing papers wrapped in oiled leather with the careful precision that characterized everything Martin had done. Inside lay documentation that represented her husband's final gift to his family. "Found them," Grace whispered, clutching the leather bundle against her chest like a shield. The rifle shot that answered her words split morning air with the flat crack of a high-powered weapon fired by a professional. Stone chips exploded from the foundation wall, inches from Grace's head, while she threw herself flat behind the overturned stove as more shots began ringing out their reports, echoing across the valley with deadly precision. "Narasuper." "How many?" Grace called, pressing deeper into minimal cover, while clutching Martin's papers with hands that refused to release evidence that could save or damn them all. "4 spread out to cover approaches," Tokala replied, placing careful shots that forced hidden gunmen to keep their heads down while he studied positions and searched for weaknesses. "Professional deployment, not random violence." Bullets whined off iron with sounds like angry hornets, followed by others that kicked up snow uncomfortably close to Grace's hiding place. The shooters were methodically zeroing in with measured fire designed to conserve ammunition while gradually eliminating options for movement or escape. Tree line northeast. Tokala decided, calculating distances and angles, while bullets continued probing their defenses. "On my signal, run low and fast. I'll provide covering fire, but you'll need to move quickly." Before Grace could acknowledge, Tokala rose and began laying down rapid fire that forced attackers behind trees and rocks, giving her opportunity to sprint toward relative safety, while bullets snapped through air around her. She made the cottonwood cluster as Tokala's ammunition ran low, and enemy fire intensified, searching for targets that had momentarily disappeared. "This way," a familiar voice called from deeper forest. Grace turned to discover Nora Elise emerging from a Pine Grove school dress replaced by practical riding clothes and neat hair braided for hard travel. The young woman carried a Winchester with competent grip, while her face showed the determined expression of someone who'd made difficult choices. "Miss Elise, what brings you here?" "Looking for you," Nora replied, helping Grace deeper into tree cover while keeping her rifle ready. "Dr. Laurent sent word that you might need assistance reaching proper authorities. I have a wagon hidden half a mile from here, along with supplies and fresh horses." More gunfire erupted from the cabin ruins as Tokala continued his fighting withdrawal, drawing pursuers away from Grace's position through tactical movement that used available cover to mask his retreat. She wanted to wait to ensure he reached safety, but understood his sacrifice would prove meaningless if she allowed capture while carrying evidence that could destroy Conrad's entire operation. "He'll find us," Nora said firmly, reading the conflict in Grace's expression. "Tokala knows this country better than Klaus's hired killers ever will. Our job is getting those papers to someone with authority to act before Conrad realizes what we've recovered." They moved through forest with careful haste that marked experienced frontier travel, following game trails and natural cover, while avoiding open spaces where movement could betray their position. Behind them, gunfire gradually faded as Tokala successfully drew Klaus's men away from their intended targets, buying precious time with personal risk. After an hour of cautious progress, they reached Nora's concealed wagon, a sturdy farm vehicle loaded with supplies and hitched to horses capable of covering serious distance. The schoolteacher had planned thoroughly, bringing food, ammunition, medical supplies, even changes of clothing appropriate for winter travel. "How did you know we'd need help?" Grace asked as they loaded possessions and prepared to continue toward whatever justice federal authorities might provide. "Because I've watched Conrad destroy this community for 2 years," Nora replied grimly. "He's driven out families who refused to sell land, burned crops that competed with his company store, threatened anyone who questioned his methods. When Dr. Laurent explained that Martin had been gathering evidence, I knew it was finally time to choose sides." As they drove away from the ruins of Grace's former life, she found herself looking back toward the forest where Tokala was still fighting to escape Klaus's pursuit. The Lakota warrior had risked everything to honor promises made to a dead man. And now, he was paying the price for her family's protection with blood and freedom that might never be recovered. He'll survive, Nora said quietly, following Grace's gaze toward distant trees. Men like Tokala don't reach 30 by making careless mistakes or surrendering when odds turn bad. Grace nodded, clutching Martin's papers, while trying to ignore fear building in her chest like a physical weight. She'd promised to belong to Tokala forever if he saved her children. But she was beginning to understand that her feelings about the Lakota warrior went deeper than gratitude or desperate bargaining. Behind them, gunfire echoed once more across the valley before fading into the silence of winter wind and falling snow. Grace Morrison pressed her face against the wagon's canvas cover and offered prayers to whatever gods protected desperate widows and men who risked their lives for promises that others might abandon when the cost became too high. The federal marshal's temporary office in Ash River occupied rooms above Patterson's Mercantile, chosen for proximity to telegraph lines, and a defensible position overlooking the main street where federal authority could be displayed prominently. Marshal Harrison James was a weathered man in his late 50s with gray temples, and the steady demeanor developed through decades of mediating disputes in territories where the nearest courthouse might require a week's hard riding. He spread Martin Morrison's carefully documented papers across a makeshift table, while Grace, Nora, and Dr. Laurent waited in chairs hastily arranged for the emergency meeting. Outside, 2 federal deputies maintained guard against interference from Conrad's supporters' rifles ready, and positions chosen to command approaches to the building where justice might finally find purchase. Remarkable documentation, Marshal James said, studying Martin's precise handwriting with the attention important evidence deserved. Fraud, environmental violations, conspiracy to commit arson, bribery of territorial officials, Mr. Morrison built a comprehensive case against the Copper Gulch mining operation. Comprehensive enough to get him murdered, Grace replied quietly, her voice carrying exhaustion from 3 days of constant travel and the strain of reliving her husband's final weeks through his meticulous records. That's what we'll determine through proper investigation. James selected a particular document, frowning at a margin notation that seemed to puzzle him. There's a reference here to witness signatures that I don't completely understand. Something about partnership insurance beyond standard transfer procedures. Grace leaned forward to examine the page, her heart stopping as she recognized Martin's careful script. T signed more than water rights transfer. Full partnership documented with territorial clerk. G doesn't know safer if details remain confidential until circumstances require revelation. The words struck Grace like a physical assault, leaving her staring at the paper, while her mind struggled to process implications she'd never considered during months of uncertainty and fear. She read the notation again, hoping for misunderstanding, but Martin's meaning was unmistakably clear. "What is it?" Dr. Laurent asked, noticing how Grace's complexion had gone ashen. "Martin made Tokala my legal partner." Grace whispered, her voice barely audible, above wind rattling the building's windows. Not just a witness to the boy's inheritance. Full partner in everything we owned. Silence fell, except for papers rustling as Marshal James searched documents for confirmation of the discovery that reshaped everyone's understanding of legal relationships that had seemed straightforward until this moment. Outside, the normal sounds of frontier town life continued. But inside the marshal's office, the implications of Martin Morrison's secret arrangements were transforming the tactical situation. "Here's the official documentation," James said, producing a document bearing the territorial seal. Partnership agreement between Martin Morrison and the individual known as Tokala, witnessed, and properly notarized according to territorial law. This grants him equal guardianship of your children and joint ownership of all marital property, Mrs. Morrison. Grace stared at the partnership papers while emotions churned between betrayal, understanding, and something approaching panic. If Takala possessed legal authority over Hugh and Archie Conrad couldn't claim guardianship through territorial courts. But it also meant this Lakota warrior she'd known less than a week had complete legal control over every aspect of her life. Her hands began to tremble. Not from cold this time, but from a rage that had been building since she'd first read Martin's margin notes. How dare he? How dare Martin make decisions about her future, her children's future, without consulting her? She'd spent 3 years as Martin's dutiful wife, following his lead, trusting his judgment. Now she was supposed to be Tokala's. What partner property responsibility? Why would Martin do this without consulting me? She asked, though part of her already comprehended her husband's reasoning. The fury in her voice surprised everyone in the room. Because he knew you'd refuse, Dr. Laurent said gently. White women on the frontier don't typically accept Indian men as partners in legal arrangements, even when those arrangements provide essential protection. But Martin was desperate, needing someone Conrad couldn't buy, threaten, or eliminate. Grace stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where she could observe Ash River's main street stretching toward the prairie beyond. Behind her, she felt the weight of attention, as everyone waited for her reaction to news that changed everything about her family's future. He trapped us both, she said finally, her voice tight with anger that had been simmering since discovering the truth. Made Tokala responsible for children he'd never met, gave him authority over a woman who had no voice in the decision. Made me dependent on someone I barely know, regardless of what I might want or need. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but Grace couldn't stop them. Months of fear, uncertainty, and feeling powerless to control her own destiny suddenly found an outlet in fury at her dead husband's manipulations. Marshal James cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Morrison, personal feelings aside, the arrangement provides significant legal protection. Conrad Dietrich cannot claim guardianship of children who already have 2 appointed guardians under territorial law. And it gives multiple approaches for challenging the mining operation's federal permits. Nora added carefully. Takala can file complaints as a treaty-recognized tribal member, while you challenge them as a territorial citizen. Together, you can attack Conrad's operations from directions he never anticipated. Grace turned back to face the room, her eyes blazing with emotions she was struggling to contain. The injustice of it all, Martin's secretive decision-making, Tokala's unwitting involvement in her fate. Conrad's threats against her children crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity about what she wanted. What I want to know, she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay composed, is whether anyone in this room cares what I actually want, or whether you're all as willing as Martin was to make decisions about my life without bothering to ask my preferences. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality that Grace Morrison had become a piece in a legal game, where her own desires seemed irrelevant to the larger strategic considerations. Before anyone could respond, a federal deputy burst through the door with news that changed everything once again. Marshal, serious trouble approaching. Conrad Dietrich just rode into town with 40 armed men heading directly toward this building. Through the window, Grace could see the dust cloud raised by approaching riders, accompanied by the ominous sound of heavily armed force moving with military precision toward a confrontation that would settle all outstanding questions through violence rather than legal maneuvering. How long? Marshal James asked, already reaching for his rifle, while calculating defensive possibilities. 3 minutes, maybe less. They're not attempting concealment. Grace looked at the partnership papers scattered across the table, then at the faces of people who'd risked their lives to help her reach this moment of potential justice. Outside, Conrad Dietrich was bringing the kind of force that had always allowed him to impose his will on anyone who dared oppose his ambitions. Her anger at Martin's manipulations would have to wait. Right now, survival took precedence over wounded pride or philosophical discussions about women's rights in territorial law. But she made a silent promise to herself: if they survived this, she would never again allow anyone, husband, partner, or protector, to make fundamental decisions about her life without her explicit consent. I suppose I'm about to discover what I really want, she said quietly, moving away from the window as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder and more threatening. Behind her, Marshal James and his deputies prepared for the kind of confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one widow and her children, but the future of everyone who dared stand against Conrad Dietrich's expanding empire of fraud and violence. Conrad Dietrich rode into Ash River's main street like a conquering general claiming territory that belonged to him through superior force and political influence. At 52, he commanded respect through wealth and intimidation. In equal measure, his expensive coat and silver-handled weapons, marking him as someone accustomed to purchasing solutions and eliminating problems that couldn't be bought. 40 men followed him in formation that spoke of military experience rather than casual employment. These were professional gunmen recruited from cattle wars and railroad disputes, where legal pressure proved insufficient. They spread along the main street with practiced efficiency, taking positions that commanded every approach to Marshal James's temporary office, while maintaining the appearance of casual deployment. Inside the mercantile's upper rooms, Grace pressed herself against the window frame where she could observe Conrad's tactical deployment without exposing herself to rifle fire. The man who'd orchestrated her husband's murder sat his horse with casual confidence, studying the building where she'd taken refuge, as if calculating the most efficient method for storming a position defended by federal law enforcement. Mrs. Morrison. Conrad's voice carried easily across the street, amplified by projection developed through years of addressing large crowds and intimidating opponents. I know you're up there. I've come to discuss a reasonable resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding. Marshal James positioned himself in the doorway, where his badge would be clearly visible, though he kept his rifle ready. Mr. Dietrich, this is a federal investigation. You have no authority here, and your armed supporters constitute interference with official proceedings. Federal investigation. Conrad's laughter was genuinely amused, as if the concept of federal oversight was too absurd for serious consideration. Marshal James, that I think there's been a significant miscommunication. Mrs. Morrison is clearly suffering from the mental strain of widowhood compounded by her inappropriate association with Indian criminals. I'm here as a concerned citizen to ensure she receives proper medical evaluation and care. What kind of medical evaluation? Grace called down, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. Conrad's expression immediately transformed into paternal concern that might have seemed genuine if his eyes hadn't remained cold and calculating. My dear Grace, you've endured terrible ordeals that no civilized woman should experience. Living in savage camps, fleeing through winter storms, with small children, placing your trust in men whose loyalty can't be guaranteed. Obviously, you need professional medical attention to recover from these traumatic experiences. Professional medical attention from whom? Dr. Kellerman has traveled here from Rapid City specifically to examine you and determine the appropriate course of treatment. He's waiting at the hotel right now, prepared to provide the compassionate care your condition obviously requires. Grace felt ice forming in her stomach as she recognized the trap Conrad was laying with polished precision. Dr. Kellerman was notorious throughout the territory for his willingness to declare inconvenient women mentally incompetent, providing legal justification for wealthy men to assume control of property and children. "And if I refuse your generous medical attention?" Conrad's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath his false compassion. "Grace, you're clearly not in a condition to make rational decisions about your own welfare or that of your children. Hugh and Archie need stability, proper schooling, medical care, comprehensive support that only established institutions can provide. Institutions under your control. And under the control of people who understand what civilized children require for proper development." Conrad's voice hardened as he abandoned the pretense of negotiation. "I'm prepared to petition the territorial court for emergency guardianship based on your obvious mental instability and the dangerous conditions you've subjected innocent children to." But even as Conrad outlined the legal trap he'd constructed, new sounds began echoing from Ash River's eastern approaches, hoofbeats accompanied by voices calling in Lakota, and distinctive war cries that meant Tokala's people were arriving to settle accounts with enemies who'd proven themselves unworthy of mercy. Conrad heard the approaching riders too, his confident expression flickering with the first uncertainty he'd shown since arriving in town. Through dust and distance, warriors were approaching in formation that suggested military precision rather than random arrival, led by a familiar figure whose wounded gait was unmistakable even from several hundred yards away. Tokala. Grace breathed relief, flooding through her, as she realized the Lakota warrior had not only escaped Klaus's pursuit, but somehow managed to gather reinforcements for the confrontation everyone had known was inevitable. Conrad's professional gunmen shifted nervously as they counted approaching riders and calculated odds that were no longer as favorable as they'd assumed. Tokala had brought 30 warriors, all mounted on horses, bred for endurance and speed, all carrying weapons that spoke of long experience with exactly this kind of territorial dispute. "This changes nothing," Conrad declared, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Federal marshals don't negotiate with Indian war parties, regardless of whatever grievances they claim against legitimate business operations." But as Tokala's band spread out to surround the town's commercial district, it became clear this wasn't a random attack by hostile Indians. These were people demanding justice through whatever means proved necessary, led by a man who possessed legal authority to challenge Conrad's actions through territorial courts and federal oversight. "Mr. Dietrich." Marshal James called down from the office window. "I believe you're about to meet Mrs. Morrison's legal partner, the man who shares guardianship of her children and joint ownership of the property you claim through debt foreclosure." For the first time since arriving in Ash River, Conrad Dietrich looked like a man who hadn't anticipated every variable in a situation rapidly spiraling beyond his control. The legal trap he'd constructed to ensure Grace's cooperation had acquired an element he'd never considered a partner with. Both the authority to challenge his claims and the military capability to enforce that challenge through direct action. As Tokala rode toward the town center, his rifle ready but not yet aimed, Grace Morrison realized the next few minutes would determine not just her family's future, but the fate of everyone who'd chosen sides in a conflict that had moved far beyond civil law enforcement into the realm where survival depended on courage, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for justice. Tokala rode into Ash River's main street with deliberate precision, his paint pony's hooves striking frozen ground, while 30 Lakota warriors spread behind him in formation that spoke of disciplined military experience. His wounded hip sent lightning bolts of agony up his spine with each stride. But his rifle remained steady, and his eyes never left Conrad Dietrich's face as he calculated distances, angles, and the positioning of professional gunmen. Conrad Dietrich. Tokala's voice carried clearly across the street, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear, but calm enough to suggest business rather than personal vengeance. I've come to discuss the debt you claim against the Morrison family. Conrad studied the Lakota warrior with the calculating gaze of a man reassessing odds that had seemed favorable just minutes earlier. His 40 gunmen still outnumbered Tokala's war party, but they were positioned for intimidating civilians rather than fighting experienced warriors who'd spread out to command every approach and escape route. You're trespassing on private property. Conrad replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he'd displayed when facing only federal marshals and a widow with 2 small children. This is a civil matter between myself and Mrs. Morrison, not a tribal dispute requiring armed intervention. Mrs. Morrison is my legal partner under territorial law. Tokala stated, producing folded documents from his coat and displaying them so everyone could see the official seals and signatures. Her debts are my responsibility. Her children are under my guardianship, and her property is jointly owned according to properly filed partnership agreements. Marshal James leaned from the office window, his federal authority lending weight to Tokala's legal position. Mr. Dietrich, the partnership documents are authentic and properly executed. Any debt collection proceedings must include both parties as co-defendants with equal standing. Conrad's expression shifted from confidence to careful calculation as he realized his legal trap had acquired complications he'd never anticipated. A Lakota warrior with legitimate standing in territorial courts could challenge debt claims through federal oversight, especially when those debts were connected to mining operations that violated treaty obligations. Even so, Conrad said slowly, the debt remains valid regardless of who assumes responsibility for payment. $1,000 plus accumulated interest and legal fees. Tokala reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with metallic sound as he held it up for everyone to see. Gold. Enough to satisfy Martin Morrison's legitimate debts to your company, plus reasonable interest. A murmur ran through the crowd of townspeople who'd gathered to witness the confrontation. Gold was always impressive on the frontier, but the sight of a Lakota warrior offering to pay a white man's debts with hard currency challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy that most people accepted without question. Grace pressed her face against the office window, staring down at the man who was offering his life savings to purchase her freedom from Conrad's financial manipulation. The gesture went far beyond the practical necessities of their legal partnership, revealing depths of commitment that made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't prepared to examine while surrounded by armed men. Where did an Indian acquire that much gold? Conrad demanded, his tone carrying suspicion reserved for transactions that seemed too advantageous to be legitimate. A Black Hills expedition 3 summers ago. Tokala replied calmly. Found a productive creek, worked it through 1 season before cavalry patrols forced relocation. Saved the proceeds for something important enough to justify the sacrifice. Gold alone doesn't resolve this matter, Conrad said, though his eyes remained fixed on the leather pouch with obvious hunger. Debt satisfaction requires proper legal documentation, territorial banking procedures, official witnesses, formal processes that take considerable time to arrange correctly. How much time? Marshal James called down. Weeks, possibly months, depending on how cooperative all parties prove during the verification process. Grace understood immediately. Conrad would accept Tokala's gold, but he'd drag out the legal procedures long enough to achieve his real objectives, gaining custody of Hugh and Archie, while eliminating witnesses who could testify about his criminal activities. There's a simpler solution, Conrad continued his voice, taking on smooth persuasiveness. A marriage arrangement that would resolve all outstanding legal complications immediately, while providing proper supervision for children who obviously require stable family environment. The proposal hit the street like a thunderclap, drawing gasps from watching townspeople and causing several of Tokala's warriors to shift their rifles toward more threatening positions. Conrad was proposing to marry Grace himself, thereby gaining legal control over her property, her children, and her ability to testify against his criminal activities. Never. Grace called down from the window, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. I'm afraid personal preferences aren't relevant when children's welfare is at stake. Conrad replied, his reasonable tone masking threats that everyone understood perfectly. The territorial court has already received preliminary guardianship petitions based on your obvious mental instability and inappropriate associations. The partnership documents, Grace began, were never properly filed with territorial authorities. Conrad interrupted smoothly. A bureaucratic oversight that renders them legally meaningless unless confirmed through expensive court proceedings that could take years to resolve. Grace felt the walls closing in as she realized the extent of Conrad's legal preparation. Every safeguard Martin had tried to establish had been anticipated and countered by Conrad's superior resources and political connections. That's when Tokala made a decision that changed everything. Nar, there is another option under territorial law. He announced, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official declarations. I challenge your guardianship claim through trial by combat. The words fell into sudden silence as everyone absorbed the implications. Trial by combat was an ancient legal tradition that territorial law still recognized in specific circumstances involving tribal customs and treaty rights, though it was rarely invoked except in the most desperate situations. Conrad stared at the Lakota warrior with genuine disbelief. That's barbaric. This is 1878, not the medieval period. Civilized men don't risk their lives in savage rituals over simple business disputes. No. Then withdraw your guardianship claim. Grace called down quickly, seeing the opening Tokala had created. Accept his gold for the debt, acknowledge the partnership documents, and leave my family in peace. Conrad looked around the street, calculating odds and assessing his position. His 40 gunmen were skilled professionals, but using them would mean open warfare with federal authorities and treaty-protected tribal members. The combat challenge was legally valid, but personally dangerous, requiring him to risk his own life rather than simply ordering subordinates to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. I need time to consider my legal options, he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. This conversation isn't over. As Conrad began organizing his men for withdrawal to a more defensible position, Grace caught Tokala's eye across the distance that separated them. In his steady gaze, she saw the same protective determination that had carried them through blizzards and gunfights, but also something deeper, a willingness to risk everything he possessed, including his life for people he'd known less than a week. Despite her earlier anger about the partnership arrangements, despite feeling manipulated by circumstances beyond her control, Grace found herself overwhelmed by the sacrifice Tokala was prepared to make. Her fury at Martin's secretive decision-making began to transform into something else, entirely a recognition that perhaps her dead husband had seen qualities in this Lakota warrior that she was only beginning to understand. Why? She called down, her voice barely audible above the wind. Tokala met her eyes with the directness that had marked all their important interactions. Because some things are worth fighting for, Grace Morrison. Because promises made to dying men deserve to be kept whatever the cost. and because you and your sons have become more important to me than my own life." The words hit Grace like a physical force, dispelling the last of her anger about Martin's arrangements and replacing it with something that made her hands tremble against the window frame. This wasn't about legal partnerships or territorial law or even her husband's desperate schemes. This was about a man who'd seen her family's need and chosen to meet it with everything he possessed, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to keep his word. As the two groups prepared for whatever resolution the next day would bring, Grace Morrison found herself contemplating the nature of belonging and partnership, debt and obligation, love and sacrifice. Tomorrow, Tokala would risk his life in single combat for the right to protect her children and honor her husband's memory. Tonight, she would have to decide what she was willing to risk in return. Dawn came to Ash River like a reluctant witness, painting the sky the color of old blood, while frost transformed every surface into a crystalline landscape that sparkled with deceptive beauty. The designated combat ground lay 100 yards south of the town's main street, a level area normally used for horse trading that had been cleared of obstacles and marked with lime powder to establish boundaries both combatants would understand. Grace Morrison stood at the marked circle's edge, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, as she watched Tokala check his weapons with methodical precision developed through a sleepless night. Around them, nearly 300 people had gathered from Ash River and the surrounding territory. Miners, ranchers, townspeople, tribal members, federal officials, and curious observers drawn by the spectacle of a legal duel. Tokala moved with careful efficiency, despite the obvious pain in his wounded hip, testing the balance and action of his Colt revolver, while Dr. Laurent examined him for injuries that might affect his performance. At 30 years old, he was 22 years younger than his opponent. But Conrad Dietrich had brought professional instruction and expensive equipment to balance natural skill and desperate motivation. "How's the hip this morning?" Dr. Laurent asked quietly, his medical bag open beside them, as he checked Tokala's pulse and reflexes with professional thoroughness. "It'll hold long enough." Tokala replied, though Grace could see lines of pain around his eyes that spoke of a wound that never quite healed properly. "Conrad's older, probably hasn't faced real combat for years. If I can make this about endurance rather than quick shooting age, we'll work against him." Conrad Dietrich emerged from the hotel wearing an expensive shooting coat and carrying a mahogany case containing matched dueling pistols worth more than most families earned in several years. At 52, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having superior resources solve problems that courage and skill might not handle adequately. Marshal James stepped forward with the formal authority required by territorial law, his voice carrying clearly across the combat ground as he outlined the rules that would govern the encounter. "Gentlemen, you have both agreed to settle the matter of guardianship for Hugh and Archie Morrison through single combat, according to the laws and customs recognized by Dakota territory. Mr. Dietrich, as the challenged party, you may select weapons and establish conditions." Conrad opened his pistol case with theatrical precision, designed to intimidate his opponent, revealing perfectly crafted Colt .45 revolvers with ivory grips and gold inlay that caught the morning light. Standard dueling protocol. Single-shot weapons 20 paces turn and fire on command. Tokala examined the offered pistol with the careful attention of someone whose life would depend on understanding every mechanical detail. The weapon was beautiful and deadly, crafted by master gunsmiths, but something in its flawless symmetry bothered him. "Dr. Laurent," he called, "would you examine both weapons for mechanical differences or unauthorized modifications?" Laurent accepted both pistols and studied them with a thoroughness that had made him a trusted medical professional throughout the territory. He tested triggers, examined cylinders, checked sight alignment, and finally pulled out a magnifying glass for detailed inspection of the firing mechanisms. After several minutes that stretched like hours, Laurent looked up with an expression of grim discovery. "The triggers have been altered," he announced to the assembled spectators. "Mr. Dietrich's weapon has been modified for approximately half the pressure required by the other pistol." A murmur of anger ran through the watching crowd as Conrad's attempted cheating was exposed. Frontier justice might be rough, but it was expected to be fair, and Conrad's willingness to cheat in a life-or-death encounter revealed the depth of his moral corruption. An innocent customization. Conrad protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've simply grown accustomed to that particular trigger response through years of practice, which creates an unfair advantage in a combat situation." Marshal James ruled firmly. "New weapons will be provided, or the challenge will be declared invalid due to attempted fraud." "I have a better suggestion," Tokala said quietly, pulling his own service revolver from its holster and handing it to Dr. Laurent, along with Conrad's unmodified dueling pistol. "Identical weapons, standard army issue. Doctor, you choose which combatant receives which weapon, but don't reveal your decision until both men are positioned." It was a psychological tactic designed to eliminate any advantage Conrad might gain through familiarity with his equipment, ensuring that both fighters would face unknown variables that made combat genuinely dangerous for everyone involved. As the combatants took their positions at opposite edges of the marked circle, Grace found herself standing between Dr. Laurent and Nora Elise, both offering silent support while she watched the man who'd become her unlikely protector, prepared to risk his life for her children's future. The morning was so quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat, could feel each breath of wind that stirred the frost on the ground. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, the way Tokala's shoulders set as he prepared for combat, the careful way Conrad tested his weapon's balance, the hundreds of faces turned toward the circle where two men would settle their dispute through violence. "Now, gentlemen, back to back in the center," Marshal James commanded. "You will walk away from each other on my count. At 20 paces you may turn and fire at will. The duel ends when one participant is unable to continue." Grace studied Tokala's face, searching for fear or hesitation, but finding only the calm focus she'd witnessed when he tracked their pursuers across frozen lakes and through blinding storms. This was a man who'd made peace with whatever outcome awaited him, accepting death as a possible price for keeping promises that others might abandon. Conrad and Tokala stood back to back in the center of the combat circle, weapons held ready, but not yet raised. The morning air carried the sharp bite of winter and the nervous breathing of spectators who understood they were about to witness something that would be remembered for years. "Begin walking," Marshal James commanded. They stepped away from each other with measured precision, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground, while Grace counted silently, her heart hammering with each pace that brought them closer to the moment when one would die and the other would claim victory. At 15 paces, Conrad suddenly stumbled, crying out as if he'd twisted his ankle on the uneven ground. Instinctively, Tokala began to turn, concerned that his opponent had suffered an accidental injury, and Conrad spun with practiced speed, his pistol already rising toward a target who'd been caught off guard by false sportsmanship. But Tokala had recognized Conrad's deception a split second before the older man completed his treacherous maneuver. He threw himself sideways as the bullet whined past his ear, close enough to burn powder residue across his cheek, rolled, came up on one knee in a shooter's stance that absorbed recoil while providing maximum stability. Conrad's shot had been rushed, fired in panic, when his deception failed to achieve the intended surprise. Tokala's response was deliberate, aimed with the precision that came from years of practice under combat conditions. The 44-40 slug took Conrad Dietrich's center mass, spinning him backward into the frost-covered earth, where dark stains began spreading beneath his expensive coat. Conrad stood for a moment with genuine surprise written across his features, as if he couldn't believe that his carefully planned advantage had failed him. Then his expensive pistol tumbled from nerveless fingers, and he toppled forward into the earth that would claim him as it claimed all men. Combat concluded. Marshal James announced formally, "By right of victory, guardianship of Hugh and Archie Morrison is confirmed to Tokala and Grace Morrison as legal partners under territorial law." But even as the crowd began reacting to the duel's outcome, Grace realized their victory was incomplete. Dutch Herman, Conrad's foreman and heir to his criminal organization, was already organizing the mining company's remaining enforcers for immediate retaliation against everyone who testified against their dead employer. Herman had 30 armed men positioned throughout the town, and with Conrad's death, they faced prosecution or hanging if the federal investigation proceeded. They were desperate men, with nothing left to lose. "Tokala," Grace called urgently, pointing toward the armed men who were spreading out to surround the combat area with obvious hostile intent. He was already moving, reloading his revolver, while scanning the positions Herman's men were taking throughout Ash River's business district. The formal duel was over, but the real battle was just beginning, a fight that would determine whether Conrad's death marked the end of his criminal empire or simply the beginning of a bloodier phase. What followed was a running gunfight that lasted nearly 2 hours and ranged across Ash River's commercial district, spilling into every building that offered cover or tactical advantage. Herman's men had superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the town's layout, but they were fighting people who had everything to lose and nothing left to negotiate. Grace found herself crouched behind the hotel's marble reception desk, with Hugh and Archie pressed against her sides. Martin's papers clutched in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other, as bullets shattered windows and chipped stone around their improvised fortress. The boys had gone quiet with a peculiar stillness that came to children when they understood that loud noises or sudden movements might draw deadly attention. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Hugh whispered, his 7-year-old voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Yes," Grace replied with more confidence than she felt checking her rifle's load while calculating how long their ammunition would last. "Tokala won't let anything happen to us. He promised your father, and he always keeps his promises." Through the hotel's front windows, she could see Tokala and Dr. Laurent maintaining defensive positions near the telegraph office. Their precise shooting forcing Herman's men to keep their heads down, while federal deputies attempted to coordinate a response that would end the violence without destroying half the town. But Herman's men were professionals who understood urban warfare tactics, and they were systematically working closer to the hotel through covered approaches that would eventually allow them to storm the building where Grace and her children had taken refuge. A bullet punched through the window frame just inches from where Grace was crouched, showering her with wood splinters and broken glass. Archie cried out in terror, and she instinctively threw herself over both boys, using her own body as a shield against the violence that seemed to have no end. "Stay down," she whispered fiercely, her maternal instincts overriding every other consideration. "Whatever happens, stay behind the desk and don't move until I tell you." Another volley of shots peppered their position, and Grace realized with growing alarm that Herman's men were concentrating their fire on the hotel. They knew she was here, knew she carried the evidence that could destroy what remained of Conrad's organization, and they were willing to kill children to silence her permanently. Just as ammunition was running dangerously low and defensive positions were becoming untenable, salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. Sheriff Walter Marcel appeared at the hotel's rear entrance, his badge glinting in the smoky light as he led 8 deputies through corridors Herman's men hadn't thought to guard. Marcel's face showed the grim determination of someone who'd finally decided to choose the right side in a conflict he'd tried to avoid through neutrality and political compromise. But this wasn't just Marcel acting alone. Grace could see other townspeople moving with the deputy's honest citizens who'd finally had enough of Conrad's reign of terror and were willing to risk their lives to end it. The storekeeper who'd extended credit to struggling families, the doctor who'd treated injured miners without payment, the minister who'd spoken against the company's brutal labor practices, all of them carrying rifles and moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd planned this intervention carefully. Mrs. Morrison. Marcel called, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing attention from the gunmen outside. "We're here to get you and the children to safety, but we need to move quickly before Herman realizes what's happening." Grace stared at the sheriff with surprise and hope warring in her chest. "Sheriff Marcel, I thought that I was Conrad's man." Marcel's smile was grim but genuine. "I was for longer than I care to admit. But reading your husband's evidence, seeing what Conrad was really doing to this territory and its people, sometimes a man has to decide what he stands for, regardless of the consequences." As if to emphasize his commitment, Marcel moved to the window where he could observe Herman's tactical deployment and began coordinating with his deputies and the civilian volunteers to establish a crossfire that would catch the mining company's gunmen between multiple defensive positions they hadn't anticipated. "What changed your mind?" Grace asked while checking her sons for injuries and preparing them for another desperate flight to safety. "Your husband's documentation showed me exactly how Conrad operated, not just the fraud and violence, but the systematic corruption that made it all possible. I realized that my cooperation, my willingness to look the other way, made me complicit in every crime he committed." Marcel's voice carried the weight of genuine regret. "Martin Morrison was a braver man than I ever was, Mrs. Morrison. The least I can do is honor his sacrifice by protecting the family he died trying to save." The battle that followed lasted another hour and ranged throughout Ash River's commercial district. But Marcel's intervention had shifted the tactical balance decisively. Herman's men found themselves outflanked and outnumbered, fighting a three-way engagement against federal marshals, local law enforcement, and Tokala's warriors who'd positioned themselves to command every escape route from the town. When the gunfire finally ended with the last shots echoing off surrounding buildings, 9 of Herman's men were dead, and the remainder were in federal custody, awaiting transportation to territorial courts. Herman himself had taken a bullet through the shoulder during the final assault and would survive to face justice for his role in Conrad's criminal organization. Grace emerged from the hotel with her sons clinging to her skirts, blinking in the afternoon sunlight that revealed a town transformed by violence, but ultimately purged of the corruption that had poisoned it. Around them, people were beginning to emerge from buildings where they'd taken shelter surveying damage and beginning the process of rebuilding their community. Tokala limped toward them through the smoke and debris, his wounded hip causing visible pain, but his expression showing the quiet satisfaction that came from promises kept and battles won through courage rather than superior resources. When he reached Grace and the boys, he knelt despite his injury so he could speak to Hugh and Archie at their own level. "Are you hurt?" he asked, examining both children with the gentle thoroughness that had characterized all his interactions with them since that first desperate night. "No, sir." Hugh replied politely, though his eyes showed the strain of witnessing violence that no child should endure. "Will the bad men come back?" "No," Tokala assured him with certainty. "They won't be coming back. You're safe now, both of you." As federal marshals began collecting evidence and documenting the full scope of Conrad's criminal enterprise, Grace Morrison found herself standing beside the man who'd risked everything to honor a promise made to her dying husband. The legal partnership Martin had created without her knowledge had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated, a bond forged through shared danger and mutual trust that went far deeper than any document could describe. But more than legal obligations or survival necessities, Grace realized she was looking at a man she'd come to love through circumstances that had tested them both in ways that revealed character and commitment that few people possessed. Her earlier anger about Martin's secretive arrangements had transformed into gratitude for her husband's wisdom in choosing a protector worthy of that trust. The territorial courthouse in Rapid City filled beyond capacity when Dutch Herman and the surviving members of Conrad Dietrich's criminal organization faced judgment for crimes that had terrorized honest citizens throughout Dakota Territory. Federal prosecutors had assembled evidence revealing a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple mining fraud, encompassing bribery, environmental destruction treaty violations, and violence against anyone who dared challenge Conrad's expanding influence. Grace Morrison sat in the witness chair for the fourth day of testimony, Martin's meticulously documented papers spread before her as she walked the packed courtroom through her husband's discovery of crimes that had cost multiple lives and destroyed entire communities. The mining operation deliberately violated federal environmental regulations. She explained to Judge Harrison Cole, a gray-haired veteran of territorial justice who'd presided over 15 years of frontier legal disputes. My husband's records show Conrad was bribing territorial officials to ensure environmental inspections were either superficial or completely falsified. What was the purpose of these violations, Mrs. Morrison? To maximize ore extraction without regard for long-term environmental damage or treaty obligations to local tribal communities who had legal rights to traditional seasonal grounds that Conrad wanted to claim through fraudulent applications. Judge Cole studied Martin's careful documentation, while the courtroom listened with the attention that important testimony deserved. These records suggest a pattern of criminal activity spanning several years. Were other individuals or organizations involved in Mr. Dietrich's conspiracy? Grace glanced toward the gallery where Takala sat with Hugh and Archie, all three listening intently as she provided testimony that would finally bring justice for the crimes that had shattered their lives. Yes, Your Honor. Martin's records identify territorial officials, mining inspectors, and federal permit officers who accepted payments in exchange for overlooking illegal activities. The revelation sent murmurs through the courtroom as several well-dressed men in the gallery shifted uncomfortably and quietly, made their way toward the exits, understanding that their own criminal activities would soon be subject to federal investigation. Judge Cole's expression grew increasingly stern as he realized the full scope of corruption that Martin Morrison's investigation had uncovered. This court will issue subpoenas for all individuals named in the deceased's records. He announced, his gavel striking with finality. The Territorial Attorney General's office will conduct comprehensive investigations of corruption in mining permit processes, and federal authorities will review all treaty compliance issues raised by this evidence. Herman, himself standing in shackles beside his court-appointed attorney, maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings despite overwhelming evidence of his direct involvement in Conrad's criminal activities. But Martin's documentation was too thorough and detailed to challenge effectively, and witness testimony from Dr. Laurent, Nora Elise, Sheriff Marcel, and others painted a picture of violence and intimidation that left no doubt about the defendant's guilt. Dutch Herman. Judge Cole pronounced after the jury's swift deliberation, "You are sentenced to 25 years in the Territorial Penitentiary for conspiracy fraud, attempted murder, and violation of federal treaty obligations. All assets of the Copper Gulch mining operation are hereby forfeited to territorial authority, and liquidation proceeds will provide restitution to victims of the criminal conspiracy." As the gavel fell with finality that marked the end of Conrad's criminal empire, Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried since Martin's death. Justice wasn't perfect. Conrad had escaped earthly punishment through death in combat. But his organization was broken, his crimes exposed, and his victims would finally receive acknowledgement of their suffering. Outside the courthouse, Tokala waited with her sons beside a wagon, loaded with their possessions and supplies for the journey back to the life they were building together in the valley he'd chosen for their new home. The boys had grown during the weeks of legal proceedings, Hugh becoming more serious and protective, while Archie had developed the charm and resilience that would serve him well in whatever future awaited them. "How did it go?" Tokala asked as Grace joined them in the afternoon sunlight. "Herman got 25 years. The mining operation is finished completely, and the territorial government is investigating everyone who took Conrad's bribes." Grace climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence as comfort that had become essential to her understanding of security and belonging. "We're finally free to go home." As they drove through Rapid City's dusty streets toward the open prairie beyond, Grace found herself thinking about the concept of home and what it meant for a widow with 2 young children who'd found herself legally partnered with a Lakota warrior through circumstances neither had chosen, but both had come to value. "Where are we going, Mama?" Hugh asked from the wagon bed where he and Archie were playing with wooden toys Winona had carved during their stay in the winter camp. Grace looked at Tokala, realizing they'd never fully discussed their long-term plans beyond surviving the immediate crisis that had brought them together through Martin's desperate arrangements and Conrad's criminal ambitions. "Where do you want to go?" Tokala asked, and Grace understood he was asking her to make a choice that went beyond simple geography, to encompass the entire future they might build together if she had the courage to embrace possibilities that their legal partnership had created. She could return to white settlements, find work teaching school or taking in sewing, raise her boys, according to conventional expectations, while trying to forget the extraordinary circumstances that had brought Tokala into their lives. Or she could embrace the partnership Martin had created, building something new that combined the best elements of both cultures, while providing Hugh and Archie with opportunities that neither community could offer alone. "I want to go somewhere the boys can grow up learning from both of us," she said finally, her voice carrying conviction that came from having thought deeply about her family's future and her own desires, rather than merely accepting what others might expect. "Somewhere they can understand both sides of their heritage and make their own choices about the kind of men they want to become." Tokala smiled with warmth that transformed his features completely, and Grace realized it was the first completely relaxed expression she'd seen from him since their desperate flight from the burning cabin. "I know the perfect place. Good water-protected valley, excellent hunting and grazing land. My band has traditional winter rights there, but summer seasons are open for farming and permanent settlement. Your people would accept us living there. They already have. Winona has been asking when you'll bring the boys back for extended visits. She says they need proper instruction in hunting tracking and horse handling skills no white school will teach them." Grace laughed, imagining her city-born sons learning to survive in conditions that would challenge grown men developing competencies that would serve them regardless of which community they ultimately chose to call home. It wouldn't be an easy life, but it would be theirs to shape, according to values they could respect and principles they could defend. 6 months later, Grace Morrison stood in the doorway of the cabin Tokala had built in their chosen valley, watching Hugh and Archie play with a litter of puppies that had been born to camp dogs from nearby Lakota settlements. Her sons had grown taller and stronger, developing the confidence that came from mastering skills that connected them to the land and weather in ways their previous urban education had never addressed. Hugh, now 9 years old, could track animals through tall grass start fires in wet conditions and communicate effectively in basic Lakota with children who visited regularly from tribal camps. But he still insisted on reading every night from books Nora Elise continued to send through irregular mail delivery, determined not to lose academic skills that might prove valuable in whatever future he eventually chose. Archie had celebrated his 6th birthday by successfully riding a pony bareback across the valley's meadows, demonstrating natural balance and fearlessness that made him popular with visiting tribal children and Lakota adults who appreciated courage and adaptability in young people. The legal partnership Martin Morrison had created without consulting his wife had evolved into something that transcended both men's original intentions. Grace and Tokala shared decisions about the children's education and discipline, the farm's management and development, and their relationships with both white and Indian communities throughout the territorial region, where their unusual family arrangement had gradually gained acceptance and even respect. More importantly, they developed personal bonds that grew from mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than romantic fantasy or social convention. They shared domestic responsibilities and child-rearing duties with practical efficiency. But they'd also learned to find comfort and joy in each other's company during long winter evenings when storms isolated them from outside contact. The romantic dimension of their relationship had developed, gradually built on trust and compatibility rather than passion or desperation. Grace had come to understand that what she'd initially seen as Martin's betrayal had actually been his final act of love, ensuring that she and the boys would be protected by someone who possessed both the capability and the character to honor that responsibility completely. As autumn evenings settled over their valley with colors that made the entire world seem touched by magic, Grace and Tokala sat on the cabin's front porch while the boys continued playing with puppies that were learning to explore the world beyond their mother's immediate protection. Grace. Tokala said quietly, reaching over to take her hand with a casual intimacy that had developed between them through countless shared tasks and mutual dependencies. Yes. I need to tell you something about that first night, about what you promised when Klaus was trying to kill us all. She waited patiently while he searched for words that could explain the difference between desperate bargains and freely chosen commitments, between belonging to someone and belonging with them. You said you'd belong to me forever if I saved your children. He continued carefully. But I want you to understand something important about what that means to me now, after everything we've been through together. Grace felt her heart begin beating faster, sensing that Tokala was about to say something that would change their relationship in ways they'd both been approaching cautiously, but inevitably. I don't want you to belong to me any more than I want to belong to you in ways that suggest ownership or obligation. He said, meeting her eyes with the directness that had marked all their important conversations. I want us to belong with each other, to this place, to the life we're building together, to the future we can create, if we have the courage to choose love over fear. Grace smiled, feeling tears she hadn't expected beginning to form, as she realized Tokala was expressing exactly what she'd been feeling, but hadn't known how to articulate. I understand completely, she whispered, leaning closer until their foreheads touched in a gesture of intimacy that spoke louder than any formal declaration. And I agree with everything you've said. Hugh ran toward the cabin, breathless with excitement that marked important childhood discoveries. Mama Tokala, the puppies opened their eyes today. Come see how they're learning to walk and explore everything. Grace and Tokala followed their sons toward the barn, where new life was developing according to natural rhythms that had governed survival and growth long before territorial governments or mining companies had attempted to impose artificial boundaries on relationships that transcended legal definitions. Behind them, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney into the clear evening air, carrying the scent of home and belonging toward stars that were beginning to appear in a sky vast enough to contain all their hopes and dreams for whatever future they would build together. In the distance, a wolf called to its mate across miles of prairie grass that waved like ocean swells in the evening breeze. And Grace Morrison felt truly free for the first time in her life. Free to choose her own path, free to define relationships according to her own values, free to belong exactly where and with whom she wanted to belong. "Thank you," Hugh said quietly as they reached the barn where puppies were indeed beginning to explore the world with curiosity and courage that reminded everyone watching of qualities that made life worth living. "For what, sweetheart?" Grace asked, kneeling to embrace her older son while feeling Archie's small arms wrap around both of them, and Tokala's solid presence provide the security that had become the foundation for everything she valued most. "For bringing us here, for finding Tokala, for making everything safe and good again after Papa died, and everything seemed so frightening and uncertain, for giving us a real family again." Grace held both sons close, while Tokala's hand settled gently on her shoulder, understanding that they'd all been given a second chance at happiness that few people ever received, and fewer still had the wisdom to recognize and courage to embrace when it appeared. "You're welcome," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being that had been transformed through experiences she wouldn't have chosen, but couldn't regret knowing that Martin's death had ultimately led to a life richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined. As autumn stars emerged above Dakota Territory's endless sky, the Morrison family expanded and redefined. By circumstances that had tested their courage and proven their capacity for love, stood together in the barn, where new life was learning to thrive under the protection of those who understood that belonging meant choosing to care for each other regardless of the challenges such commitment might bring. The future stretched ahead, like an unmarked trail leading toward horizons that promised both adventure and security, challenge and reward, in proportions that would depend entirely on the courage and wisdom they brought to each decision and each day of the life they were building together in the heart of a territory that was finally learning what it meant to be home. To all its people, regardless of race or background or the circumstances that had brought them together in a place where justice and mercy could coexist with progress and prosperity. For everyone willing to work toward a future worthy of their dreams.